My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. My mother dropped a bomb in our family group chat. She announced that on Thursday, all 20 of our relatives were descending on my beach house for 2 weeks, demanding I have everything fully catered. My husband calmly replied that our toddler was battling severe pneumonia and begged them to postpone. My father shot back that nothing was changing, and we needed to prepare the guest rooms immediately. I replied with a single word: fine. What they did not realize was that fine meant I was locking every single door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build a fortress to protect your family from the people who share your blood. I run an elite underground crisis management and public relations firm for high net worth individuals, while my 34-year-old husband David is a top-tier cybersecurity architect. We spend our lives solving complex, high-stakes disasters for billionaires, but absolutely nothing could prepare us for the absolute nightmare unfolding on our own front lawn. Inside the master bedroom of our Hamptons beach house, the air felt suffocatingly heavy. The only sound was the frantic, terrifying beeping of our 2-year-old daughter Lily's oxygen monitor. Her tiny chest hitched with every shallow, rattling breath. The digital numbers on the screen blinked a warning neon red. Her fever was holding stubbornly at 102 degrees. I grabbed a cool washcloth, my hands trembling as I gently wiped the beads of sweat from her pale forehead. I whispered soothing words, praying for the medication to kick in, praying for just a moment of peace so her little lungs could rest. That fragile peace was violently shattered. A chorus of car horns erupted from our private driveway, an aggressive, entitled blaring that cut right through the quiet hum of Lily's medical equipment. I jolted, nearly dropping the damp washcloth onto the hardwood floor. Lily whimpered, her tiny body tensing in her sleep, her eyes fluttering shut in absolute exhaustion. David rushed to the bedroom window, his jaw clenching so tight a muscle ticked rapidly in his cheek. He did not say a word. He just handed me his tablet, which was connected to our perimeter security cameras. 5 luxury sport utility vehicles were parked haphazardly across our manicured front lawn, their heavy tires sinking deep into the fresh grass. The doors flew open and a chaotic parade of 20 relatives spilled out, dragging designer luggage and shouting loudly over each other. They were laughing, pointing at the private beach access, and acting as if they had just arrived at an all-inclusive tropical resort. My parents had actually done it. They had brought the entire extended family for a free vacation, completely and utterly indifferent to the critical medical crisis they were explicitly warned about just 24 hours prior. A sharp, relentless banging echoed from the ground floor, vibrating violently up the wooden staircase. It was my mother, Patricia. She was pounding her heavy diamond rings against the reinforced glass of our front door, her face twisted in annoyance. "Natalie, open this door right now!" Her shrill voice pierced the thick glass and carried all the way up to the second floor. "I told you to have the lobster catered by noon. We have been sitting in traffic for 3 hours and your father is starving." I stared at the tablet screen in utter disbelief. My daughter was upstairs fighting for her life on an oxygen machine, and my mother was throwing a childish tantrum about catered seafood. I ignored the relentless pounding, turning my full attention back to the oxygen flow valve on Lily's tank. I carefully adjusted the dial, ensuring the clear plastic mask rested securely over her small nose and mouth. David paced frantically behind me, his eyes locked on the live high-definition video feed. "Look at them, Natalie. Look at your father. He is actually directing your cousins to start unloading the heavy coolers. They really think they are just going to waltz in here and take over our entire home." I glanced at the monitor again. My father Richard was barking loud, demanding orders at my teenage nephews, pointing authoritatively toward our private pool area. He was treating our safe sanctuary like his own personal kingdom. It was a sickeningly familiar sight. Growing up, my parents had always treated my personal belongings, my private space, and my boundaries as trivial things they could trample at will without any hesitation. They viewed me not as an independent, loving daughter, but as a convenient financial resource meant only to cater to their public image and incredibly selfish desires. Nearby, my sister Brittany was posing for a glamorous selfie in front of my beach house, while her husband Kendrick loudly complained to anyone listening about the complete lack of valet service. The banging on the front door rapidly escalated from an annoying, persistent rhythm to a violent, aggressive smashing. Patricia was completely losing her patience. Through the high-definition camera feed, I watched her flawless, expensive country club exterior slip away, revealing the raw, highly entitled rage simmering underneath. She turned away from the locked door for a brief moment, marching purposefully toward the beautiful decorative garden beds lining the brick walkway. My heart immediately leaped into my throat as I realized exactly what she was doing. She bent down tightly, wrapping her perfectly manicured hands around a heavy, solid stone garden statue. She lifted the heavy statue high above her head, turning back toward the glass door, fully intending to completely smash her way into my safe and quiet home. Absolutely determined to destroy my boundaries by any means necessary. Completely disregarding the medical emergency occurring inside and the safety of her own sick granddaughter lying completely helpless upstairs in bed, David did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the illuminated screen of the smart home control panel. He tapped the microphone icon for the front porch camera, and his voice projected through the high-definition exterior speakers. It was dangerously calm, stripped of all emotion, and sharp enough to cut glass. Patricia, put the statue down right now. Lily's fever is 102 degrees. She is breathing with the assistance of a machine. You are not coming in. The booming sound of David's voice echoing across the manicured driveway caught my mother off guard. She froze with the heavy stone angel hoisted above her perfectly styled hair. For a fraction of a second, the sheer authority in his tone actually worked. Her arms wavered, but before she could either lower the statue or throw it through the glass, my father stepped into the camera frame. Richard did not look concerned about his granddaughter. He looked furious that a boundary had been drawn. He reached out and forcefully shoved his wife aside, grabbing the stone statue from her hands and dropping it onto the porch with a loud thud that made the camera shake. Patricia immediately started pacing behind him, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and muttering insults under her breath. She waved frantically at my aunt and uncle, who were standing by the third vehicle, instructing them to keep unloading the massive amounts of luggage. They blindly followed her instructions, pulling out giant rolling coolers packed with expensive seafood and premium liquor bottles. None of them even bothered to look up at the second-story window where my sick child was fighting for her breath. They simply expected the locked door to magically yield to their collective sense of entitlement. He leaned his face directly into the camera lens. His features were distorted by anger. His skin flushed red above the collar of his expensive polo shirt. "Open this door right this second, David," Richard bellowed into the microphone, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do not play these pathetic games with me. We drove 3 hours, and we are not standing out here like common criminals. That kid is just faking a cough for attention because Natalie taught her how to play the victim. It is a minor cold." I sat on the edge of the master bed, clutching my toddler's burning hand. Hearing my father casually dismiss a life-threatening case of pneumonia as a fake cough sent a wave of pure bile up my throat. Lily let out a weak, rattling wheeze beneath her oxygen mask. Her chest heaved with the monumental effort of simply existing. I kept my eyes locked on the monitor, watching the man who was supposed to be my protector demand I risk my child's life for his convenience. "I am not unlocking the door, Dad." I leaned forward and spoke clearly into the microphone beside David. "My daughter is severely immunocompromised right now. You brought 20 people here without asking. Half of those cousins just flew in from out of state. We told you yesterday that Lily was hospitalized and we needed isolation. You are carrying germs that could literally kill her. Go book a hotel." Richard scoffed loudly, a harsh sound of pure disbelief. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring up at the lens with the exact same look of disgust he had directed at me my entire life. "Do not use that dramatic nonsense on me, Natalie," he shouted back, pointing a thick finger at the camera. "You have always been weak. You have always exaggerated every little ache and pain to get out of your responsibilities. When you ruptured your appendix at 16, you spent the entire morning crying on the bathroom floor claiming you were dying. I still made you get up, put on your uniform, and serve drinks at Brittany's sweet 16 birthday party. You survived that just fine, did you not? You stood on your feet and served the catered appetizers until midnight before we finally took you to the emergency room. This is no different. Stop coddling that kid and open the door. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He was actually weaponizing the darkest moment of my teenage years, using the memory of his own medical neglect as a justification to endanger my daughter. He wore that memory like a badge of honor, proof of his strict parenting rather than an admission of child abuse. He truly believed that my sole purpose in life was to cater to the golden child of the family, and that Lily's purpose was to be quiet and invisible. David gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning completely white, his jaw locked tightly. I placed my hand over his wrist, silently urging him to stay calm. We could not afford to lose our tempers. We needed to hold the perimeter. "We are done talking, Richard," David said into the microphone, his voice dropping an octave. "Get off my property." My father slammed his hand flat against the glass door, leaving a greasy handprint on the pristine surface. "Your property." He spat the words out like poison. "This is a family asset. I am the patriarch of this family, and I decide who stays here. Now unlock the deadbolt. Kendrick and his VIP investors need to use the pool immediately." Right on cue, Kendrick strutted directly into the camera frame. My brother-in-law wore a crisp, expensive linen suit. He bypassed the throng of confused relatives and shoved his way onto the porch. In his right hand, he casually swung a polished titanium golf club. He pointed the heavy metal shaft directly at the camera lens, laughing arrogantly. "Listen to your father, Natalie," he shouted, his ego expanding. "My VIP investors are out here sweating, and we need the pool. Open this door, or I swear I will smash these custom patio windows myself. Do not test me, Natalie." Kendrick swung the titanium golf club backward, testing his grip. His face was twisted in a mixture of extreme arrogance and entitled rage. Before he could take a swing, another voice sliced through the tension outside. It was Brittany, my golden child sister, holding her phone high in the air with the recording light flashing red. She had angled the camera to capture herself, looking perfectly distressed, with our locked front door in the background. She was speaking directly to her 500,000 online followers, spinning a narrative of total victimhood. She wiped a fake tear from her cheek and told her audience that I had lost my mind and was holding the family vacation hostage. Then she turned the camera toward our young nieces and nephews, who were running wild on the lawn. Brittany did not stop at playing the victim. Instead of stopping them, she actively encouraged the escalating chaos. She pointed at the large custom patio windows and told the children that Aunt Natalie was hiding their vacation inside. She told them to find some rocks from the landscaping and show Aunt Natalie how much they wanted to swim. The young kids aged 6 to 10 eagerly obeyed the golden child. They began scooping up the heavy, smooth river stones we had carefully placed around the hydrangeas. The first rock hit the living room window with a sharp, terrifying crack. The reinforced glass held but a spiderweb fracture bloomed across the surface. Another rock hit the siding, followed by the chilling sound of Kendrick cheering them on. They were literally weaponizing innocent children to completely destroy our property, while Lily lay struggling to breathe just a few feet away. David did not raise his voice. He did not issue another warning through the intercom. He simply turned away from the window and looked down at his customized tablet. As a top-tier cybersecurity architect, he had designed our home network to withstand highly coordinated physical and digital threats. He tapped a single red icon on the screen. A deep mechanical hum instantly reverberated through the floors and walls of the beach house. Outside, the chaotic screaming and the sound of rocks hitting the glass were suddenly drowned out by the grinding of heavy industrial motors. From the hidden recesses above every single window and door, thick military-grade aluminum hurricane shutters began to rapidly descend. The heavy metal panels slammed down with deafening finality, locking into the reinforced steel tracks anchored in the foundation. The living room went completely dark, as the sunlight was entirely blocked out, followed by the kitchen, the dining room, and finally the master bedroom. The house transitioned to backup generator power, and soft amber emergency lighting flickered on, illuminating the hallways. We were no longer standing inside a luxury Hamptons beach house. David had turned our home into an impenetrable black box fortress. The heavy aluminum completely sealed us off from the mob outside, protecting the sterile environment Lily desperately needed to survive. The noise from the front lawn was instantly muffled, reduced to distant and pathetic thumping against the thick metal armor. I switched my gaze to the security monitors, which now provided our only view of the outside world. Through the infrared camera feeds, I watched the sheer panic and fury wash over my relatives. Patricia rushed the front door just as the final shutter locked into place. She slammed her fists against the cold aluminum, her face contorted in absolute disbelief. The microphone picked up her muffled screams. "You ungrateful brat!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a shaking finger at the camera lens. "You think you can lock us out? This house was bought with family money. My money. Your father and I paid for this estate so we could have a place to host our guests. You are nothing but a squatter in a house we own. I will have the police drag you out in handcuffs for squatting on family property. You are going to regret ever disrespecting us like this. We will ruin your pathetic little life and take everything away from you." Her words were sharp and full of the same toxic poison she had fed me my entire life. She was proudly claiming ownership of a property she had absolutely no legal right to, while simultaneously reducing me to a criminal intruder in my own home. For 33 years, Patricia had used financial manipulation to control every narrative. She truly believed that repeating a lie loud enough would magically make it the truth. She believed that because they had once held the mortgage 6 years ago, she could dictate who entered the home and who was thrown out on the street. She was completely unaware that I had secretly purchased the foreclosed debt, saving them from public ruin, while keeping the title exclusively in my name. I let her scream, watching her embarrass herself in front of the investors Kendrick had brought along. The pounding on the aluminum shutters eventually slowed as her hands began to bruise. Patricia stepped back, her chest heaving with exertion. She pulled her phone from her designer handbag and furiously dialed a number, shouting orders at whoever answered on the other end. She demanded immediate service and threatened to double their normal fee if they hurried. She paced back and forth across the front porch, promising Kendrick and Brittany that she was handling the situation and that they would be inside the house within the hour. 5 minutes later, a loud engine roared down the street. A rugged, heavily dented locksmith van aggressively turned into our driveway. The driver did not even bother to slow down or stop on the paved driveway. He clearly wanted to make an intimidating and highly dramatic entrance. The van hopped the curb, tearing through the pristine front lawn, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the grass before screeching to a sudden halt mere feet from the front porch. The heavy door of the rusted van slammed open. A massive man stepped onto the grass, wearing a heavy leather tool belt and carrying a thick steel drill. The yellow lettering on his shirt read, "Gary's Elite Lock and Safe." The angry relatives parted for him, stepping aside like he was a conquering hero, arriving to liberate their stolen vacation. My father Richard strutted forward, ignoring the deep tire tracks tearing up the lawn. He marched up to the locksmith, reached into his designer jacket pocket, and yanked out a folded paper. He thrust the crumpled paper directly into Gary's face. "I am the legal owner of this estate." Richard barked, his voice dripping with the entitled authority he used to terrify corporate employees. "My daughter suffered a complete mental breakdown and locked us out. I need you to drill through those smart locks right now and force the security shutters open." Gary squinted, shifting his drill to his left hand to take the document. Through the security cameras, I could see the paper was a blurry photocopy lacking official seals or notarized stamps. Gary looked from the pathetic excuse for a deed up to the massive shutters sealing our home. He hesitated, recognizing this was not a standard lockout. "I do not know about this, sir," Gary muttered. "Those are blast-rated storm shutters, and this deed looks like a copy of a copy. I am supposed to verify primary identification before destroying $50,000 worth of custom security hardware. Richard stepped into his personal space using his physical height to intimidate the man. Do not question me. I run a multinational real estate firm and pay more in taxes than you will make in 3 lifetimes. If you do not put that drill against that door in 5 seconds, I will personally ensure your lock business loses its commercial license by tomorrow morning. It was the classic Richard maneuver to bully, humiliate, and threaten financial ruin until the target submitted. Gary swallowed hard, nodding slowly, intimidated by the threat to his livelihood. He raised the heavy drill and took a step toward our reinforced front entryway. Inside the dark master bedroom upstairs, David did not blink. He did not ask for permission and showed no fear. He simply toggled a switch on his control panel, routing his microphone directly through our outdoor entertainment system. We had originally installed the speakers for hosting summer poolside barbecues, but now David was using them as a weapon. Before the drill bit could touch the lock, a deafening, ear-splitting siren ripped through the salty ocean air. The sheer volume of the alarm forced every person on the front lawn to cover their ears. Some of the younger nieces and nephews dropped to their knees in shock. Gary staggered backward, dropping his drill onto the brick walkway. The siren blared for 10 agonizing seconds, disorienting the angry mob before abruptly cutting off, replaced by David's chillingly calm voice echoing across the property. Gary Thomas Henderson. David's voice boomed from the hidden speakers, sounding like an omnipotent force. You are driving a commercial vehicle with New York license plate, Echo Delta 749er. Your business tax identification number is actively registered in Suffolk County. You are currently standing on private property without the legal consent of the verified owners. Gary froze, his eyes darting around the yard, searching for the source. Richard grabbed his arm, yelling for him to pick up the drill, but David continued speaking, cutting through the absolute chaos. The document you were just handed is a fraudulent photocopy of a voided mortgage agreement. David broadcasted, his voice devoid of hesitation. If your drill touches my door, you will be instantly engaging in breaking and entering. You will be aiding a forced home invasion, and you will be held personally liable for the destruction of secure property. I have your face, your license, and your commercial registration recorded on 5 high-definition cameras. I will forward this footage to the district attorney and press for federal prosecution. Gary looked at the cameras mounted under the eaves, and then looked at Richard, who was red-faced and screaming profanities at the speakers. The burly locksmith realized instantly that he was stepping into a massive legal trap. He was being used as a disposable pawn in a wealthy family dispute, and he was the one who was going to serve a federal prison sentence. Pick up the drill, Richard demanded, grabbing the collar of the locksmith's shirt. I am ordering you to open this house. Gary aggressively shoved my father backward, causing Richard to stumble, slipping on the wet grass. I am not going to federal prison for you, Gary yelled, shoving the fake deed hard into Richard's chest. You people are completely insane. Gary scooped up his drill, sprinted back to his van, and threw it into reverse. The tires spun wildly, throwing clumps of mud across Patricia's designer shoes as the van tore out of the driveway, speeding down the street and disappearing in pure, unadulterated terror. The silence that followed was absolute. The 20 relatives stood frozen, staring at the muddy tracks ruining the lawn. My father stood there panting in humiliation, adjusting his wrinkled designer suit jacket after being publicly defied and bested. Patricia stepped forward, wiping mud off her shoes, her face pale with pure rage. She looked at the cameras, her eyes burning with a hatred I had never seen before. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, hands shaking with fury. You want to play with the law, Natalie? She screamed, her voice echoing across the empty yard. You want to bring the authorities into this so Fine too can play that game? She furiously punched 3 numbers on her screen, holding the phone to her ear. I watched the monitor as Patricia dialed 911, preparing to unleash her ultimate weapon of manipulation. This was what she always did. The distant wail of sirens cut through the heavy silence left in the locksmith's wake. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the sleek aluminum surface of our barricaded home. Two Hamptons police cruisers swung violently into the driveway, tires crunching over the gravel and stopping just short of the deep, muddy ruts the van had left behind. The heavy car doors swung open and Officer Mitchell stepped out onto the driveway. He was a veteran cop with graying hair at his temples, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt as he surveyed the bizarre scene. 20 people standing amidst a mountain of designer luggage, staring at a house locked down like a military bunker. A second officer emerged from the passenger side, resting his hand on his radio, looking equally perplexed by the sheer volume of people trespassing on our property. Patricia did not waste a single second. The moment the officer's boots hit the pavement, she transformed. The screaming, entitled woman, who had just threatened to ruin my life, vanished instantly. In her place appeared a frail, terrified grandmother pushed to the absolute brink of despair. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that echoed across the lawn and practically threw herself toward the approaching officers. Her knees buckled just at the right moment, sending her sinking into the manicured grass. She clutched her chest with one hand and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at our metal-shuttered windows. "Officer, please help us," Patricia wailed, the tears flowing flawlessly down her cheeks. "My mentally unstable daughter locked us out of our own vacation home. We drove all the way from the city to check on her because she has been having these terrible paranoid episodes. We just wanted to help, but the moment we arrived, she triggered these security doors and trapped herself inside. She is holding my sick grandchild hostage in there right now, and she is completely denying her the critical medical care she desperately needs. My sweet little Lily is struggling to breathe, and Natalie refuses to let anyone in to treat her." The lie was so incredibly vicious and perfectly delivered that it made my blood run entirely cold. I stood frozen in the master bedroom, staring at the security monitor in sheer disbelief. My mother was actually trying to weaponize the police against me by projecting her own historical medical neglect onto my current situation. She knew exactly what to say to trigger an immediate emergency response. By claiming a child was in immediate medical danger and held hostage by an unstable parent, she was forcing the police to treat our secure home as an active crime scene, rather than a simple property dispute. Richard stepped forward to support her performance, placing a comforting hand on her shaking shoulder while looking gravely at Officer Mitchell. He played the part of the stoic, concerned patriarch to absolute perfection. "She has a history of these irrational outbursts," Richard lied smoothly, his voice dripping with paternal concern. "We own this estate. We let her stay here to recover, but her mental state has rapidly deteriorated. She completely severed the outdoor power and trapped our 2-year-old granddaughter inside a dark house without proper ventilation. The child has severe pneumonia, officer. We are terrified she might not survive the afternoon if you do not intervene." Inside the bedroom, Lily shifted restlessly in her crib, the steady hum of her oxygen concentrator proving my father to be a total liar. But the police outside could not see the medical equipment, the carefully administered antibiotics, or the controlled environment David and I had created to save our daughter. They only saw a fortress and a weeping grandmother. Brittany joined the chorus, stepping right up to the officers with her phone still recording her expression, a mask of manufactured horror. She pointed at the spiderweb crack in the living room window, claiming Natalie had thrown something heavy from the inside before the shutters slammed down conveniently, omitting the fact that she had instructed her nieces and nephews to hurl riverstones at the glass just minutes prior. David did not say a word. He stood beside me, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the rapidly escalating situation on the glowing monitors. The legal implications of Patricia's lies were immense. If the police genuinely believed a child was in imminent medical danger, they had the legal authority to breach the premises by any means necessary. They would tear the shutters off the tracks, shatter the glass, and storm the house, exposing Lily to the exact pathogens we had isolated her from. He knew that reasoning with a tactical team in the middle of a perceived hostage crisis would be utterly impossible. The moment the heavily armed officers breached the perimeter, they would arrest us both and hand our sick baby straight over to the very people trying to destroy our lives. The situation was teetering completely out of control very quickly right about now. Officer Mitchell looked from the weeping Patricia to the grimly nodding Richard, and finally to the massive aluminum barricades encasing the property. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder, issuing a rapid request for emergency medical services and a tactical breaching unit. He bought the entire performance without a single ounce of hesitation. He marched purposefully across the lawn, his heavy boots trampling the remaining flowers along the brick pathway. He stepped onto the front porch, bypassing the heavy stone statue my mother had dropped earlier. Officer Mitchell drew his heavy tactical baton from his belt. He raised his arm and struck the thick steel shutter covering the front door with terrifying force. The loud metallic bang reverberated through the entire house, violently startling Lily awake. "Natalie Wilson, this is the police!" Officer Mitchell shouted, his voice booming through the aluminum barrier. "Surrender the child immediately so we can administer medical aid, or we will breach these walls and take you into custody." The heavy car doors swung open, and Officer Mitchell stepped out onto the driveway. He was a veteran cop with graying hair at his temples, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt as he surveyed the bizarre scene. He saw 20 people standing amidst a mountain of designer luggage, staring at a house locked down like a military bunker. A second officer emerged from the passenger side, resting his hand on his radio, looking equally perplexed by the sheer volume of people trespassing on our property. Patricia did not waste a single second adjusting her posture for maximum effect. The moment the officer's boots hit the pavement, Patricia completely transformed. The screaming, entitled woman who had just threatened to ruin my life vanished instantly. In her place appeared a frail, terrified grandmother pushed to the absolute brink of despair. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that echoed across the lawn and practically threw herself toward the approaching officers. Her knees buckled just at the right moment, sending her sinking into the manicured grass. She clutched her chest with one hand and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at our metal-shuttered windows, perfectly on cue for them. "Officer, please help us," Patricia wailed, the tears flowing flawlessly down her cheeks. My mentally unstable daughter locked us out of our own vacation home. We drove all the way from the city to check on her because she has been having these terrible paranoid episodes. We just wanted to help, but the moment we arrived, she triggered these security doors and trapped herself inside. She is holding my sick grandchild hostage in there right now, and she is completely denying her the critical medical care she desperately needs. My sweet little Lily is struggling to breathe inside there today. The lie was so incredibly vicious and perfectly delivered that it made my blood run entirely cold. I stood frozen in the master bedroom, staring at the security monitor in sheer disbelief. My mother was actually trying to weaponize the police against me by projecting her own historical medical neglect onto my current situation. She knew exactly what to say to trigger an immediate emergency response. By claiming a child was in immediate medical danger and held hostage by an unstable parent, she was forcing the police to treat our secure home as an active crime scene right now, today. Richard stepped forward to support her performance, placing a comforting hand on her shaking shoulder while looking gravely at Officer Mitchell. He played the part of the stoic, concerned patriarch to absolute perfection. "She has a history of these irrational outbursts," Richard lied smoothly, his voice dripping with paternal concern. "We own this estate. We let her stay here to recover, but her mental state has rapidly deteriorated. She completely severed the outdoor power and trapped our 2-year-old granddaughter inside a dark house without proper ventilation. The child has severe pneumonia, officer, and needs a doctor right now. We are terrified she might not survive the afternoon if you do not intervene." Richard continued smoothly, adjusting his designer suit. Brittany joined the chorus, stepping right up to the officers, with her phone still recording her expression, a mask of manufactured horror. She pointed at the spiderweb crack in the living room window, claiming I had thrown something heavy from the inside, before the shutters slammed down. She conveniently omitted the fact that she had actively instructed her young nieces and nephews to hurl heavy river stones at the glass just minutes prior to the police arriving here today. David did not say a word. He stood beside me, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the rapidly escalating situation on the glowing monitors. The legal implications of Patricia's lies were immense and highly dangerous. If the police genuinely believed a child was in imminent medical danger, they had the legal authority to breach the premises by any means necessary. They would tear the shutters off the tracks, shatter the glass, and storm the house, exposing Lily to the exact pathogens we had isolated her from. He knew that reasoning with them right now would be completely impossible for us. The moment the heavily armed officers breached the perimeter, they would arrest us both and hand our sick baby straight over to the very people trying to destroy our lives. The situation was teetering completely out of control very quickly. Officer Mitchell looked from the weeping Patricia to the grimly nodding Richard, and finally to the massive aluminum barricades encasing the property. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder, issuing a rapid request for emergency medical services and a tactical breaching unit. He bought the entire performance without a single ounce of hesitation, marching purposefully across the lawn right now. His heavy boots trampled the remaining flowers along the brick pathway as he stepped onto the front porch, bypassing the heavy stone statue my mother had dropped earlier. Officer Mitchell drew his heavy tactical baton from his belt, gripping it tightly in his right hand. He raised his arm and struck the thick steel shutter covering the front door with terrifying force. The loud metallic bang reverberated through the entire house, violently startling Lily awake. "Natalie Wilson, surrender the child immediately so we can administer medical aid, or we will breach these walls and take you into custody right now." The heavy metallic echo of the police baton striking the aluminum shutter vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. Officer Mitchell stood on the porch with his weapon raised, preparing to strike the barrier again. Inside the master bedroom, I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I was not going to let this escalate into a violent tactical breach. I turned away from the glowing security monitors and grabbed the thick manila folder resting on the bedside table. It contained every single medical document from our grueling 2-month stay at the pediatric intensive care unit. I also grabbed the portable digital tablet displaying Lily's active pulse oximeter readings, showing her blood oxygen levels holding steady in the safe zone. David caught my arm, his eyes wide with concern as I marched toward the reinforced second-story window directly above the front porch. I entered the override code into the wall keypad, temporarily disengaging the blast locks for this specific window. The heavy steel mechanisms clanked loudly as they released their grip on the frame. I gripped the heavy latch and forced the thick, impact-resistant glass upward, opening it just a single inch. The cold, salty ocean air instantly rushed through the narrow gap, carrying the sound of Patricia's fake theatrical sobbing and the restless murmurs of the angry relatives gathered on our lawn. I pressed my face close to the narrow opening, looking directly down at the police officers standing on my front porch. I shoved the thick stack of medical documents through the narrow gap, letting them flutter down like a flock of heavy white birds. The pages scattered across the brick pathway, landing right at Officer Mitchell's heavy black boots. Next, I carefully slid the glowing digital monitor through the opening, securing it tightly by its thick rubber strap, so it dangled just above their heads. The bright green numbers flashed in the fading afternoon light, proving the child inside was currently stable, but requiring continuous monitoring. I pressed my mouth near the crack in the glass, making sure my voice carried over the sound of the ocean wind and the murmuring crowd below. "My daughter has severe pneumonia," I shouted down to the officers, my voice echoing clearly across the chaotic driveway. These 20 people are trying to force their way into a sterile environment. They are carrying outside pathogens and trying to break into a home where an immunocompromised child is finally recovering from a near-fatal respiratory infection. If you breach those doors and let that untreated air inside you, will be actively endangering her life. Officer Mitchell paused, his baton still raised high in the air, ready to deliver another punishing blow to our front door. He looked up at the narrow crack in the reinforced window, and then looked down at the sheer volume of medical papers scattered haphazardly across the wet, decorative bricks. He slowly lowered his weapon and bent his knees to pick up the top sheet of paper. It was a formal discharge summary from Mount Sinai Pediatric Hospital, complete with official hospital letterhead, chief physician's signatures, and strict, uncompromising instructions for strict at-home quarantine protocols. Beside him, the second police officer reached up and carefully caught the dangling monitor studying the real-time oxygen saturation and heart rate graphs illuminating the small screen. For a brief moment, the tense atmosphere shifted dramatically. The police officers were highly trained to recognize authentic medical documentation, and the detailed paperwork lying at their feet sharply contradicted Patricia's hysterical claims of a violent hostage situation. Richard realized the narrative was rapidly slipping away from his absolute control, and he reacted with immediate, unbridled fury. He shoved his way roughly past his weeping wife and marched directly up to Officer Mitchell, demanding his full attention. Richard scoffed loudly, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, as he pointed an accusing finger up at my cracked window. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Richard barked, his voice vibrating with absolute disdain. "She is completely lying to you, officer. She is just a failed event planner, trying to steal a multi-million-dollar estate from her own family." He reached into his designer jacket pocket and aggressively shoved the folded photocopy of the voided deed directly into Officer Mitchell's chest. "My real estate firm owns this property," Richard roared, projecting his voice so every relative on the lawn could hear his declaration of ultimate power. "We are the rightful legal owners, and she is a delusional trespasser using a sick child as a human shield to avoid being lawfully evicted." Officer Mitchell stood caught entirely between two wildly conflicting realities. In his left hand, he held an authentic hospital document detailing a severe pediatric respiratory infection requiring strict environmental isolation. In his right hand, he held a blurry, unnotarized photocopy of a property deed shoved at him by an enraged billionaire demanding immediate violent action. He looked from the highly detailed medical charts to the screaming patriarch and then back to the imposing aluminum fortress towering ominously over them. The situation had mutated from a simple medical welfare check into a massive legal nightmare involving high-stakes real estate wealthy combatants and a potentially critically ill child locked inside a blast-proof vault. The veteran cop frowned deeply, his brow furrowing as he processed the sheer complexity of the bizarre standoff. He realized that a simple two-man patrol unit was completely unequipped to handle a barricaded suspect scenario involving pediatric intensive care protocols and disputed property laws. He took a slow, cautious step back from the edge of the brick porch, putting some much-needed physical distance between himself and my furious, screaming father. Officer Mitchell unclipped the heavy black radio microphone attached to his shoulder epaulette and pressed the transmission button. "Send backup," he ordered, his voice tight with professional urgency. "We have a property dispute and potential child endangerment. Prepare for forced entry." The radio crackled with a sharp burst of static as the dispatcher acknowledged Officer Mitchell's request for tactical backup. The atmosphere on the front lawn shifted from chaotic panic to a much more dangerous and simmering kind of tension. The 20 angry guests, who were essentially wealthy tech investors and elite socialites, began murmuring anxiously among themselves right now. They were no longer just annoyed vacationers waiting for entry. They were angry billionaires realizing their luxurious weekend was rapidly dissolving into a highly publicized and incredibly messy police standoff. Kendrick violently shoved his way through the cluster of designer luggage and stepped directly into the center of the driveway. He wore a crisp $5,000 bespoke Italian suit that looked entirely out of place on a muddy lawn. He completely ignored the yellow police tape Officer Mitchell's partner was attempting to string across the perimeter of the driveway. Kendrick marched right past the two bewildered and frustrated officers. His expensive leather dress shoes clicked loudly against the brick. He did not care about the medical documents fluttering nearby. He did not care that the police had requested backup. Kendrick only cared about his own immediate financial inconvenience today. He tilted his head back and yelled directly up at the narrow 1-inch gap in my reinforced bedroom window. "Listen carefully, Natalie," He shouted, his voice dripping with absolute contempt and the kind of toxic arrogance money usually buys. My tech startup Apex Solutions goes public with an IPO in exactly 5 days, and nothing will ruin this launch. Do you have any idea what that actually means today? It means my VIP investors, the people currently sweating profusely on your muddy lawn, are about to make me a billionaire, and you are ruining our critical final strategy weekend. Open that door right now, or my legal team will obliterate your pathetic little PR gig by tomorrow morning permanently. You do not play in my league and never will. Kendrick paced back and forth across the front porch steps. He treated the armed police officers like minor annoyance guards. He projected his voice so every single investor could hear his brutal and highly calculated assessment of my overall worth. You have always been the family servant, Kendrick sneered loudly. He was intentionally reinforcing the ultimate dynamic that had governed my entire existence and dictated every single family interaction ever. Wealth dictates authority in this family, and you have none. We make the money, and you serve the absolute elites. You were only invited on this trip to manage catering. We expected you to serve drinks and change the bedsheets. You are a poor disposable event planner who could not even afford a proper wedding without begging for a handout. Mom and Dad brought you along to be the hired help because you are practically bankrupt and owe us everything. You exist solely to cater to our needs and whims. Now stop throwing a childish temper tantrum and open up. Unlock the damn security shutters and apologize to my investors. Do it before I ruin what little is left of your miserable, irrelevant life and bury you in legal fees. Up in the master bedroom, the heavy blast shutters blocked most of the ambient light, casting the room in shadow. The cool blue glow of my security monitors illuminated everything. I watched Kendrick pacing on the porch through the cameras. My heart had been hammering against my ribs moments ago. But Kendrick's predictable arrogance had a remarkably grounding effect now. Instead of crying or feeling the familiar crush of humiliation, my public relations CEO brain kicked into high gear instantly. I had spent years building a highly specialized crisis firm. I did not plan parties or arrange flowers for weddings. I managed the reputations of people far more powerful globally. I turned away from the cracked window and sat down. I positioned myself at the heavy oak desk right now. I had set up my mobile command center right there. My fingers danced across the illuminated keyboard with practiced precision. I initiated a rapid facial recognition sweep using the cameras. I targeted the live security footage of the wealthy crowd. Within seconds, my proprietary software began identifying every single VIP. I cataloged every investor Kendrick had brought along today perfectly. I ran a deep digital footprint trace on each individual. The system pulled up their offshore accounts and hidden affiliations. It compiled their private communications and buried corporate scandal histories. Meanwhile, the live stream Brittany had initiated was still broadcasting. She was pushing her narrative to 500,000 followers. The chat window on my secondary monitor was a blur. It displayed a constant stream of rapid-fire text updates. Thousands of comments flooded in every single second without stopping. They were filled with vicious threats directed straight at me. The digital mob demanded I release the child immediately today. They begged the police to kick the door down violently. Brittany weaponized her tears to keep her massive audience engaged. My sister lost her mind, she sobbed to her followers. She is holding my sick niece for ransom right now. She is trying to extort my parents for more money. I completely ignored the digital mob and their unhinged threats. My eyes were locked onto Kendrick through the camera feed. He was stepping up aggressively toward the yellow police line. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and exhaled slowly. A slow, cold smirk spread across my face right then. I opened a hidden encrypted drive on my computer. I typed in the complex passcode to bypass 2 firewalls. The screen loaded a directory filled with highly classified documents. I moved my mouse and clicked on a massive file. It was a master folder that was very clearly labeled. The bold letters spelled out the words, Project Apex perfectly. Kendrick had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. His entire tech empire was resting in the palm of my hand. My finger hovered over the enter key, ready to execute the command that would legally obliterate Kendrick's impending initial public offering. The encrypted files of Project Apex contained every single illicit wire transfer and fraudulent user metric his tech startup had buried over the last 3 years. Releasing those documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission would instantly trigger federal audits and freeze his assets permanently. I watched him strut across the lawn on the high-definition monitor, still shouting threats at the aluminum barricades. Before I could press the key to finalize his financial ruin, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the heavy oak desk. The screen illuminated the darkened bedroom, casting a harsh white glare across my face. A text message from my mother appeared on the locked screen. I opened the message and stared at the glowing letters in pure disbelief. "Open the door right now," Patricia demanded, her text vibrating with sheer entitlement. "We will take the first floor and the pool. You and the sick brat stay locked upstairs so you do not ruin our vibe. Do it right this second, or I will contact the lawyers and write you out of the family will permanently." I read the sickening ultimatum 3 times, letting the absolute cruelty of her words sink into my bones. "You and the sick brat stay locked upstairs." It perfectly encapsulated 33 years of my existence within this toxic family dynamic. I was never a daughter to her. I was an inconvenient prop. When I had the flu at 7 years old, she banished me to the unfinished basement for 10 days because my coughing annoyed her wealthy dinner guests. When I broke my collarbone in high school, she refused to drive me to the emergency room because blood might stain the leather seats of her new luxury sedan. I was always treated like a contagious burden meant to be quarantined away from their perfect, curated lives. She demanded I confine myself and my critically ill infant to a single room just so she could sip champagne by the pool with her elite friends. The threat of being written out of the will was her ultimate weapon. It was the exact same financial leash she used to control my siblings, to force them into marriages they hated and careers they despised. She thought the promise of future millions would force me to surrender my dignity and endanger my child's life. She thought wrong. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. I did not draft a long emotional response defending my position or pleading for maternal empathy. I did not attempt to explain the severe reality of pediatric pneumonia to a woman who possessed a heart made of pure ice. I simply tapped the screen and typed back a single word: "No." I hit send and tossed the phone face down onto the desk. The sheer finality of that single syllable severed the last remaining thread connecting me to her toxic empire. I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders instantly. There would be no more groveling for her approval or attending miserable holiday dinners to maintain a fake image. I was finally free. Outside, the police officers were still waiting for their tactical backup to arrive. Officer Mitchell had stepped away from the front porch, holding the hospital documents and speaking urgently into his shoulder radio. Kendrick had stopped pacing and was aggressively typing on his phone, completely oblivious to the digital bomb I was about to drop on his fraudulent company. The mob of angry relatives milled around the muddy lawn, complaining loudly about the humidity and the lack of proper catering. I turned my attention back to the glowing computer monitors. It was time to initiate the final phase of my strategy. I reached for the mouse, preparing to send the Project Apex files to the federal authorities. The room was deathly quiet, except for the low, rhythmic hum of the servers and the steady, reassuring whoosh of Lily's pediatric oxygen concentrator. David stood near the doorway, keeping a watchful eye on the hallway security cameras in case any of the relatives attempted to bypass the perimeter fencing. We had the situation entirely under control. We had successfully defended our fortress and exposed their lies to the authorities. The worst of the confrontation seemed to be over. We were finally winning this battle against my incredibly toxic relatives and their relentless entitlement. I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute peace wash over my tired mind. I was ready to end this nightmare permanently. Suddenly, a harsh, blaring alarm erupted inside the master bedroom. The piercing electronic screech shattered the quiet calm of our secure sanctuary. I spun around in my desk chair, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. Across the dark room, Lily's medical-grade oxygen machine was flashing a bright warning red. The continuous rhythmic whoosh of the vital machine had abruptly stopped, replaced by a terrifying mechanical sputtering sound. I sprinted across the hardwood floor, knocking the heavy desk chair backward. I dropped to my knees beside the wooden crib, my hands shaking uncontrollably, as I grabbed the small digital monitor strapped to Lily's tiny foot. The bright green numbers on the screen were rapidly dropping. Her blood oxygen saturation levels plummeted from a stable 98 down to 90, then 88, then 86. She let out a weak, rattling cough, her tiny chest heaving as she struggled desperately to pull air into her compromised lungs. The machine shrieked louder, demanding immediate attention. Her SpO2 dropped to 84%. Her lips were turning a terrifying shade of blue. "David!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the room in absolute terror. "David, get in here right now!" He burst through the bedroom door, instantly dropping his radio. We had to get to the nearest hospital immediately right now today, and we had no time to waste at all. David quickly snatched his smartphone from his pants pocket. His fingers moved frantically, dialing emergency services, as I scooped Lily from the crib. Her body felt entirely too limp in my arms. Her chest shuddered with sharp gasps as she fought to draw oxygen into her failing lungs. The pale blue tint spreading across her lips sent a surge of adrenaline straight through my veins. I wrapped her tightly in a sterile blanket, pressing her face against my collarbone. David threw his phone onto speaker mode, gripping my shoulder as we sprinted down the hallway. The dispatcher answered immediately, her voice echoing in the empty space. David shouted our address and explained the critical respiratory failure demanding a pediatric emergency unit. The dispatcher confirmed an ambulance was already turning onto our street. The piercing wail of the emergency siren sliced the coastal air, growing much louder with each passing second. The flashing lights painted the cracks in our reinforced window shutters, illuminating the dark staircase as we rushed down to the foyer. I clutched Lily tightly, praying for her chest to keep moving. We reached the front entrance, just as the heavy ambulance roared into our driveway, parking haphazardly across the manicured grass. 2 more police cruisers pulled up right behind the paramedics, responding to Officer Mitchell's request for tactical backup. The flashing lights cast chaotic shadows over the front lawn, revealing the mob of 20 wealthy relatives still clustered near the porch. I simply did not have time to think about the enormous risk of exposing our home. I slammed my palm against the master control panel next to the front door. I punched in the override sequence to disengage the lockdown protocols. A loud mechanical buzzer sounded. The heavy internal deadbolts snapped back into their housings. The thick metal barricades and aluminum shutters groaned loudly as they began to slowly rise. The mechanisms whined, revealing the chaotic scene outside. I shoved the heavy oak double doors wide open before the security shutters had even fully retracted. I sprinted out onto the porch, carrying my dying daughter. David charged out right behind me, waving his arms frantically at the paramedics jumping out of the ambulance. Lily let out a weak, rattling wheeze, her head rolling back against my shoulder. The blue color around her mouth was deepening into a terrifying shade of violet. "Over here!" David roared, pointing at us as the 2 paramedics rushed toward the porch, carrying heavy trauma bags and portable oxygen equipment. Officer Mitchell and his partner moved quickly, trying to create a safe corridor for the medical team to reach us. The flashing lights blinded me, but I kept my eyes locked on the paramedics rushing up the pathway. I expected the crowd of family members to step back. I expected basic human decency to take over. I expected them to see a mother holding a suffocating infant and immediately clear the way for the medical professionals. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Patricia stood at the base of the steps, staring directly at Lily's blue lips and limp body. My mother did not gasp in horror. She did not ask if her granddaughter was breathing. Her eyes darted from my terrified face straight to the wide-open front doors standing unguarded behind me. A sharp, triumphant smile spread across her face. Patricia turned immediately to Richard, forcefully grabbing his right arm and pointing at the empty foyer. Richard saw the opening, and his eyes lit up with predatory excitement. He turned toward the cluster of 20 wealthy investors and elite socialites loitering on the damp grass. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers loudly, giving a sharp, commanding wave. "The door's open!" Richard yelled over the sound of the ambulance engine. "Grab your bags right now. We are claiming the first floor and the master suites. Move before she tries to lock us out again." The scene that unfolded next defied every law of nature and basic morality. A stampede of incredibly wealthy adults entirely ignored the pediatric medical emergency happening right in front of them. Women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits lunged for their custom leather luggage. They dragged their heavy rolling suitcases through the mud, completely trampling the flower beds as they rushed the front porch. The paramedics were sprinting up the stairs trying to reach Lily, but my family actively blocked their path. "Excuse me," a paramedic shouted, trying to push past my uncle, who was dragging a massive trunk up the brick steps. "We have a critical pediatric patient right here. Move out of the way now." My uncle completely ignored the medical worker. He aggressively shouldered his way up the stairs, keeping his eyes locked on the open doorway. Patricia led the charge, strutting proudly onto the porch and brushing right past me without a single glance at the dying child in my arms. She stepped over the threshold into my home, breathing a sigh of relief as she escaped the humid air. The rest of the mob followed her lead, swarming the porch like vultures. They squeezed forcefully past the two paramedics, shoving their heavy bags against the fragile medical equipment. They bumped into David, throwing elbows and complaining loudly about the mud on their expensive shoes. A towering cousin carrying two heavy garment bags shoved his way up the final step. He did not even look down as he forced his way past the lead paramedic, who was actively trying to place an oxygen mask over Lily's pale face. The cousin threw his shoulder forward to clear a path. His heavy body slammed directly into the paramedic's chest, throwing the medical worker completely off balance. The paramedic stumbled backward on the slick bricks. He lost his grip on the portable medical equipment. The heavy green oxygen tank slipped from his hands and crashed violently down onto the wet grass, rolling rapidly away from us. Lily gasped for vital air, her small chest shuddering violently. David did not hesitate. The sight of his daughter suffocating while arrogant billionaires trampled her medical lifeline shattered his last remaining ounce of restraint. He lunged forward across the brick porch, lowering his strong shoulder like a heavy battering ram, and slammed his full body weight directly into Richard's chest. The sudden, violent impact lifted the wealthy patriarch entirely off his feet. Richard stumbled backward, his expensive leather loafers slipping awkwardly on the damp steps. He flailed his arms wildly, crashing hard into a towering stack of Louis Vuitton suitcases before collapsing onto the muddy grass below. The sudden display of physical force sent a massive shockwave through the invading crowd. Patricia shrieked loudly, clutching her diamond necklace as she pressed herself tightly against the aluminum doorframe to avoid the tumbling luggage. But the brief pause in the chaos lasted only a fraction of a second. Kendrick witnessed his powerful father hit the ground, and his fragile ego instantly ignited into action. The elite tech CEO shoved his way roughly past a terrified cousin, his pristine $5,000 bespoke suit instantly forgotten in a sudden blinding rage. He charged up the concrete steps, his handsome face contorted into a dark mask of pure venomous fury. "Don't you dare touch him, you broke loser!" Kendrick roared, his voice cracking with unchecked aggression and toxic entitlement. He planted his right foot on the top step and threw a wild, looping punch aimed directly at David's jaw. David, running on pure adrenaline and deep protective instinct, easily ducked beneath the poorly aimed strike. Kendrick's swinging momentum carried his body forward, throwing him completely off balance. He collided heavily with David's shoulder, and the two men crashed backward into the remaining pile of luxury designer luggage. Heavy leather suitcases and rigid travel trunks went flying violently across the crowded porch like discarded bowling pins. A massive silver suitcase careened off the brick ledge and slammed violently into the shins of the second police officer, knocking him entirely off balance. The chaotic tangle of flailing limbs, tumbling luxury bags, and shouting wealthy relatives transformed the narrow front entrance into an absolute terrifying war zone. The lead paramedic was trapped directly in the center of the mayhem, desperately trying to shield Lily's frail, sick body from the violent crossfire while crawling on his scraped knees to quickly retrieve the runaway oxygen tank from the garden. "Back up!" Officer Mitchell bellowed loudly. His voice boomed with absolute terrifying authority, echoing sharply off the towering aluminum shutters above our heads. The veteran cop had finally seen enough of this elite madness. He unholstered his bright yellow taser in one fluid, rapid motion, the built-in laser sight activating instantly in the fading light. He pointed the weapon straight at Kendrick's chest, the tiny glowing red dot resting directly over the tech CEO's pounding heart. "I said back the hell up right now! Everyone freeze or you are going down!" Officer Mitchell screamed, his index finger resting heavily on the sensitive trigger mechanism. The sharp, authoritative command finally sliced through the surrounding madness. The sheer, terrifying reality of an armed police officer, actively preparing to deploy a high-voltage weapon, brought the physical violence to an immediate, jarring halt. Kendrick froze instantly in his tracks, his trembling hands raised high in the air, his chest heaving heavily as he stared nervously down the dark barrel of the taser. David quickly scrambled backward across the bricks, putting his body between the frozen tech billionaire and the struggling paramedic. The front lawn went completely silent, save for the mechanical hum of the idling ambulance engine and Lily's terrifying, rattling wet gasps. The lead paramedic finally snatched the heavy green cylinder from the thick mud, twisting the metal valve open rapidly and pressing the clear plastic mask tightly over my daughter's face. I fell to my knees on the cold brick floor, wrapping my arms tightly around the medic and my precious child sobbing uncontrollably as the medical oxygen finally flowed smoothly into her failing lungs. Yet even with a police weapon actively drawn and a toddler actively dying on the front porch, the underlying absolute lack of empathy from my blood relatives reached an absolutely sickening peak. Nobody looked at Lily. Not a single person in that massive crowd of 20 elite socialites asked if the child was breathing. They were completely unfazed by the terrifying pediatric medical emergency unfolding mere inches away from their expensive imported shoes. Instead, the self-absorbed relatives immediately began complaining loudly about the physical inconvenience of the brief scuffle. My wealthy uncle aggressively dusted off his tailored slacks, glaring furiously at the brown mud splattered across his pristine cuffs. "This is completely unacceptable," he muttered bitterly to his wife, visibly annoyed by the unexpected delay. "We have been traveling all morning and now our expensive luggage is getting ruined in the dirt." Patricia stepped away from the doorframe, her face set in a cold, furious scowl. She completely ignored the dedicated paramedic working frantically to stabilize her own sick granddaughter. She looked directly at Officer Mitchell, her tone dripping with toxic, unforgiving entitlement. "Officer, you need to arrest that dangerous man immediately," Patricia demanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger straight at David. "He just viciously assaulted my husband without any provocation whatsoever. We are the legal owners of this estate, and we demand that you remove these violent trespassers so we can finally get inside and unpack our things." Richard slowly picked himself up from the wet grass, brushing dirt off his ruined designer jacket. He sneered at David, unbothered by the fact that his reckless actions had endangered a pediatric patient's life. The bright green numbers on the portable pulse oximeter flickered erratically before slowly beginning their upward climb. 86, 89, 92. The terrifying violet hue surrounding Lily's mouth gradually faded into a pale, sickly gray, and then agonizingly slowly, a faint hint of natural pink returned to her lips. She let out a weak, rattling cry that sounded like music to my terrified ears. The second paramedic moved with practiced efficiency, unfolding the collapsible pediatric stretcher and locking the wheels into place right in the middle of our grand foyer. They lifted Lily onto the sterile white sheets, strapping her small body down with heavy canvas belts, to ensure she remained perfectly stable during the chaotic transport. David stood guard at the base of the stretcher, his broad shoulders squared, physically blocking any of the wealthy relatives who dared to drift too close to the medical equipment. Officer Mitchell kept his yellow taser drawn, sweeping his stern gaze across the entitled mob of billionaires and socialites who had just violently invaded our home. The intense tactical presence finally forced the crowd of unwanted guests to step back, but their compliance was born out of profound annoyance rather than basic human decency. They grumbled bitterly about the flashing lights and the muddy footprints ruining the expensive imported rugs in the entryway. Not a single person in that massive cluster of family members bothered to look down at the critically ill toddler fighting for her life on the stretcher. The paramedics barked sharp commands to each other, hoisting the heavy stretcher and pivoting toward the wide-open front doors. I grabbed my purse and the thick manila folder of medical documents, preparing to sprint out to the waiting ambulance. Just as the medical team began to roll the stretcher across the threshold, my sister Brittany sauntered up the front steps. She held a massive designer sun hat over her head to block the fading afternoon light, completely ignoring the flashing red and blue strobes illuminating the driveway. She wore a pristine white silk sundress and carried a tiny leather handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. Brittany did not pause when she saw the paramedics struggling to maneuver the heavy medical cot down the brick stairs. She did not express a single ounce of shock or maternal concern for her dying niece. Instead, she adjusted her oversized sunglasses and casually stepped right over a discarded red trauma bag lying haphazardly on the porch. She paused directly in my path, forcing me to abruptly halt my frantic sprint to the ambulance. Brittany let out a loud, exaggerated huff of absolute exasperation. She looked directly at me, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of severe inconvenience. "Finally, the door is open," Brittany complained, her sharp voice cutting clearly through the wail of the idling sirens. "Go to the hospital already so we can unpack our things in peace. My skin is literally ruined from standing out in the sun for an hour." I stopped dead in my tracks. My expensive leather boots froze against the muddy brick patio. The chaotic noise of the police radios, the shouting paramedics, and the murmuring crowd of wealthy investors instantly faded into a dull, distant ringing in my ears. I stared directly into Brittany's perfectly vacant blue eyes, and in that exact fraction of a second, an extraordinary internal shift occurred. For 33 years, I had bent over backward trying to earn a single scrap of genuine affection from these people. I had accepted their constant verbal abuse, endured their public humiliation, and swallowed my own pride just to maintain the toxic illusion of family harmony. I had catered their ridiculous luxury parties, managed their catastrophic public relations disasters, and silently absorbed the painful reality that I was nothing more than the disposable family servant. I had spent my entire life yearning for a mother who actually cared, a father who actually respected my independence, and siblings who viewed me as an equal human being. All of that desperate, pathetic yearning evaporated instantly. It vanished like a single drop of water hitting a scorching desert highway. The heavy, suffocating blanket of lifelong submission lifted from my shoulders, leaving behind an incredibly clear, razor-sharp sense of absolute emotional detachment. The hot, frantic tears that had been threatening to spill over my eyelashes completely dried up. My chest stopped heaving, my breathing slowed into a steady, calculated rhythm. The frightened, desperate daughter who had begged these people for basic mercy died right there on the front porch. I felt my facial muscles relax into a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. I looked at Brittany, then at Patricia directing the luggage carriers in the foyer, and finally at Kendrick smoothing his ruined suit jacket. They were not my family, they were simply targets. I turned away from Brittany without saying a single word. I watched the paramedics securely load Lily into the back of the brightly lit ambulance, the heavy doors slamming shut with a reassuring metallic thud. David stood by the bumper, his face pale with lingering terror, waiting for me to join him for the ride to the emergency room. I walked calmly down the steps, my posture straight and perfectly rigid. I approached my husband, grabbing his trembling hand in my own firm grip. I did not cry. I leaned in close to his ear, ensuring my voice was completely masked by the roaring diesel engine of the ambulance. "Initiate Protocol 0. I whispered directly into his left ear, my voice completely devoid of any trace of human emotion. "Call Attorney Keller. End them all." David gave a single sharp nod. He stepped away from the heavy ambulance doors and immediately raised his cell phone to his ear, his eyes locked on my face. The medical team secured the latches, and the driver shifted the vehicle into gear. I did not climb inside the transport bay just yet. Lily was finally stabilized and safe in the capable hands of the paramedics. I needed to finish the war that my family had just brought to my front steps. I turned my back to the flashing red lights and faced the porch. Officer Mitchell was still holding his bright yellow taser directly at Kendrick's chest. The veteran cop barked another fierce command, demanding that the entire crowd of wealthy intruders step back and line up against the brick retaining wall. Kendrick slowly lowered his arms, his face flushed with extreme humiliation, but he obeyed the firm directive. The rest of the elite socialites grumbled and adjusted their designer jackets, shuffling awkwardly away from the front doors. They muttered angry complaints about the damp grass ruining their expensive Italian leather shoes. Richard aggressively pushed his way to the front of the agitated crowd. His tailored suit was covered in thick brown mud from his humiliating fall, but his monumental ego remained completely intact. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined blazer and pulled out a sharply folded document. He brandished the thick parchment like a weapon, marching straight toward Officer Mitchell with a look of supreme authority. Patricia followed right behind him, her chin raised high as she glared at the police officers. Richard shoved the document aggressively toward the officer's chest. He demanded that Mitchell immediately arrest David for assault and then forcibly remove us from the property. Richard loudly proclaimed that the massive estate was his personal corporate asset. He boasted to the surrounding officers about his vast real estate portfolio and his immense legal power. He claimed he had graciously allowed his ungrateful daughter to live in the home out of pure charity, but that generosity was now officially terminated. He demanded immediate access to the master suites so his exhausted guests could finally unpack their designer luggage and begin their luxurious coastal vacation. He sneered at David, completely unbothered by the fact that his reckless actions had endangered a pediatric patient mere moments ago. Officer Mitchell holstered his taser, keeping a watchful eye on Kendrick before taking the document from Richard's impatient hand. The cop retrieved a rugged police tablet from his utility belt and tapped the screen several times to access the official county property database. He cross-referenced the names and addresses, his face remaining entirely stoic. The chaotic murmurs of the wealthy relatives slowly died down as they waited for the police to validate their hostile takeover. They stood clutching their luxury luggage, expecting to be ushered inside the fortress at any second. Brittany stood near the flower bed, checking her reflection in a compact mirror and complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her perfect hair. She completely ignored the flashing lights and the serious law enforcement presence waiting eagerly to claim the best guest bedroom. Officer Mitchell finally looked up from his glowing screen. He handed the folded parchment back to Richard. The veteran cop looked from the digital tablet directly into Richard's incredibly smug face. Sir Officer Mitchell said coldly, "This piece of paper you handed me is a mortgage document from 6 years ago. You are not the registered owner of this estate." Richard's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. His face dropped into a mask of pure bewildered rage. He snatched the paper from the officer's hand and aggressively tapped the embossed seal. "That is absolutely impossible," Richard shouted, his voice echoing sharply across the manicured lawn. "I am the patriarch of this family. My company owns this property. I purchased this exact lot 6 years ago under Apex Holdings to shield our corporate assets from federal audits. I control every single deed, every trust fund, and every financial account in this family." Richard frantically waved the outdated document, refusing to accept the harsh reality staring him in the face. Patricia stepped forward, her face pale as she demanded the officer check the system again, claiming there must be a massive clerical error. Kendrick joined the chorus of outrage, shouting loudly about incompetent civil servants and threatening to have Mitchell fired immediately. The other relatives began shouting as well, their previous excitement replaced by a sudden wave of defensive panic. They had traveled all this way expecting a free luxury vacation, and now their powerful patriarch was being publicly humiliated by a local police officer. They were so completely blinded by their own relentless greed and toxic entitlement that they entirely failed to notice my calm, deliberate approach. They truly believed their massive wealth made them invincible. I walked slowly across the damp driveway, leaving the idling ambulance directly behind me. My footsteps fell silently on the wet pavement. I stopped right at the edge of the brick pathway, positioning myself between the angry mob and the flashing police cruisers. I watched them scream and argue over a house they no longer possessed. Their absolute lack of empathy for my daughter had severed the last remaining shred of my patience. They had invaded my home, endangered my child, and treated my family like disposable garbage. I looked at Richard, his face turning purple as he continued to berate the stoic police officer. I looked at Patricia, her hands trembling with indignation as she demanded access to my property. I looked at Brittany, still focused on her ruined skin and designer luggage. I felt absolutely nothing for any of them. No fear, no lingering guilt, and no love. I did not raise my voice or shout over their chaotic bickering. I simply stood by the ambulance doors and cleared my throat. The sharp sound cut through the evening air. The entire driveway fell dead silent as I spoke up. The heavy, oppressive silence hanging over the damp driveway was absolute. I stepped away from the rear bumper of the ambulance, leaving the flashing red lights behind me. I walked slowly toward the center of the chaotic scene. Every single eye in the crowd tracked my movement. The wealthy relatives who had just shoved into my home stood frozen. I stopped a few feet away from where Richard was frantically waving his outdated, worthless piece of paper at the police officer. I squared my shoulders, looking directly into my father's panicked, bloodshot eyes. My voice was remarkably calm, projecting clearly through the heavy, humid night air with absolute lethal precision. 6 years ago, my voice rang out with lethal precision. You secretly remortgaged this house to pay off Brittany's $800,000 gambling debts. The bank was foreclosing. I used my life savings and created an anonymous LLC to buy the debt and the deed out from under you, allowing you to stay on as a tenant to save your pathetic pride. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the mob of 20 elite socialites. The pristine, carefully curated illusion of the mighty patriarch and his flawless golden child shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. Whispers erupted immediately among the cousins and uncles who had always bowed down to Richard's supposed financial supremacy. The dark secret was finally outed. I watched the color rapidly drain from Patricia's face. Her heavily powdered cheeks turned a sickly ghost-white shade. She slowly rotated her head, looking at Brittany in absolute horror. The perfect favored daughter, the one who could do absolutely no wrong, was suddenly exposed as a massive liability who had nearly bankrupted the entire family. Brittany physically shrank backward against the brick column of the porch. Her designer handbag slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the wet concrete with a dull thud. Her mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, desperately searching for a lie that could save her reputation. Kendrick whipped his head around to glare at his wife, his jaw dropping in pure disbelief. He clearly had absolutely no idea about the massive gambling debts. The tech CEO, who had just tried to punch my husband over a perceived slight to his powerful father-in-law, now realized he had married into a house of cards. The shame radiating off Brittany's trembling frame was palpable. Richard stood completely immobilized on the muddy grass. His hand, still clutching the 6-year-old mortgage document, dropped limply to his side. The arrogant sneer that had defined his entire existence melted away, replaced by the terrified expression of a man who had just lost his entire kingdom. He tried to speak, attempting to formulate a booming denial to regain control of his audience, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He knew I was telling the exact truth. He had spent the last 6 years strutting around this massive estate, acting like a king, completely unaware that his despised, forgotten daughter was his actual landlord. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I had spent my entire life starving for his validation, constantly shrinking myself to make room for his massive ego and Brittany's endless demands. I had sacrificed my own peace to keep their secrets and fund their extravagant lifestyle behind the scenes. No more. The vulnerable woman who had begged for their love died the moment they trampled over my suffocating infant. You thought you were invincible. I continued, my tone dropping to an icy, unforgiving register. You thought you could just snap your fingers and invade my sanctuary while my daughter was fighting for her very life. You thought I would simply step aside and let you claim the master suites because I have always been the quiet, obedient disappointment. But you entirely miscalculated. You never owned this fortress, Richard. You merely lived here because I allowed it. Your entire existence over the last half-decade has been funded by my charity, and right now that charity is permanently revoked. I turned my gaze away from his crumbling posture and looked directly at the rest of the silent, shocked crowd. The relatives who had readily trampled my flower beds and assaulted medical professionals were now clutching their Louis Vuitton luggage with profound uncertainty. They looked to Richard for guidance, waiting for the patriarch to unleash his legal wrath and put me back in my proper place. But Richard remained completely silent, staring blankly at the mud coating his expensive leather shoes. I took one final step forward, ensuring my posture radiated absolute authority. I looked directly at Officer Mitchell, who was already referencing the digital property database on his glowing police tablet. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every single syllable landed with devastating finality. Under New York state law, I declared, my voice ringing out across the pristine lawn, I am the sole absolute owner of this property. Officer Mitchell tapped his screen one final time. He nodded sharply, his seasoned eyes scanning the digital deed that clearly displayed my anonymous LLC and my legal name as the primary controlling entity. The veteran cop locked his tablet and clipped it securely back onto his heavy utility belt. He adjusted his stance, resting his right hand casually near his service weapon. He had seen enough elite entitlement for one evening. He looked at Richard's defeated posture, then swept his stern, uncompromising gaze over the 20 wealthy relatives standing awkwardly on my manicured grass. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers illuminated their utterly bewildered faces. They were entirely stranded, their luxurious vacation plans suddenly reduced to a humiliating public eviction. Officer Mitchell squared his broad shoulders. He turned his full attention to the mob of relatives still desperately gripping their designer luggage handles. You heard the lady, Officer Mitchell stated, his commanding voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. You are all trespassing on private property. Officer Mitchell unclipped the heavy black radio from his utility belt and spoke a brief, sharp code into the receiver. 2 more patrol cars instantly activated their blinding rooftop strobes, casting harsh, sweeping shadows across the manicured lawn. The veteran policeman stepped forward, squaring his shoulders against the hostile crowd of billionaires. He raised his hand, pointing a commanding finger toward the wrought iron gates at the bottom of the long driveway. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate this property. Officer Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. If a single person is still standing on this driveway when my timer goes off, you will be placed in handcuffs, read your rights, and transported to the county jail for criminal trespassing. The clock starts right now. The sheer finality of his words struck the crowd like a physical blow. Total panic erupted. The 20 elite relatives who had spent the last hour demanding room service and fresh towels suddenly morphed into a terrified, chaotic stampede. Aunts and uncles violently shoved each other out of the way, desperate to reach their luxury SUVs parked haphazardly along the street. The heavy, muddy terrain proved disastrous for their panicked retreat. Aunts in silk dresses slipped on the wet grass, staining their expensive couture with thick brown sludge. Uncles abandoned their dignified postures, cursing loudly as they dragged massive, heavy Louis Vuitton trunks through the deep puddles. The deafening screech of rolling luggage wheels, scraping violently against the exposed brick pathway, filled the humid air. Every single one of them cared only about saving their own skin, perfectly willing to abandon their beloved patriarch if it meant avoiding the absolute scandal of a highly publicized arrest. Brittany stood frozen near the flower beds, completely unequipped to handle her own baggage. She shrieked for someone to help her carry her massive wardrobe cases, but the rest of the family entirely ignored her. Kendrick grabbed his wife by the arm, roughly pulling her toward their vehicle, utterly abandoning her imported luggage in the mud. The tech CEO kept his head ducked low, shielding his face from the dashboard cameras of the police cruisers. He knew an arrest record would obliterate his pending corporate launch. The mighty patriarch Richard remained completely paralyzed on the lawn. He watched his entire dynasty flee in absolute terror, his mind unable to process the total destruction of his invincible empire. But Patricia did not run. The severe public humiliation of being evicted by law enforcement right in front of her wealthy peers and investors finally broke her. The elegant, carefully crafted mask of the untouchable society matriarch shattered completely, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched straight toward me, her designer heels clicking frantically on the wet pavement. She ignored the warning shout from Officer Mitchell and stopped mere inches from my face. Her chest heaved violently, her perfectly styled hair falling in damp, messy strands across her forehead. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think you have won!" Patricia screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, piercing shriek that halted the fleeing relatives in their tracks. "You think you are powerful because you stole one house from us? You are absolutely nothing. You have always been nothing. I will completely destroy you for this. I will call the brokers and sell the Manhattan brownstone tomorrow morning. I will liquidate the primary estate and officially cut you out of the family trust forever. You will not see a single dime of our wealth. And when Kendrick's tech company goes public next month, his IPO will generate enough capital to buy your pathetic little public relations firm and dismantle it piece by piece. I will personally make sure your name is blacklisted in every corporate circle in America. You will never work in this industry again. You will be ruined." Her frantic threats echoed against the brick facade of my home. For 33 years, the mere mention of being cut from the family trust or blacklisted from the corporate world would have sent me into a desperate panic. I would have dropped to my knees, begged for her forgiveness, and done absolutely anything to regain her conditional approval. Patricia expected me to crumble. She stood there panting, waiting for the familiar fear to wash over my face, waiting for her obedient, disposable daughter to surrender to her overwhelming financial supremacy. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not offer a single word of apology. My heart maintained a slow, steady, entirely relaxed rhythm. I looked at the raging woman standing before me and felt a profound sense of absolute detachment. The frantic threats of a desperate, defeated tyrant held no power over me anymore. I slowly reached into the pocket of my damp jacket and retrieved my smartphone. I unlocked the screen with a calm, deliberate swipe of my thumb. The bright backlight illuminated my face in the darkening evening. Officer Mitchell took a step forward, his hand resting on his radio, preparing to intervene if Patricia's rage turned physical. I held up my free hand, signaling the officer to hold his position. I did not need police protection from my mother. I needed her to understand exactly how deeply she had underestimated me. I kept my eyes locked on the digital screen, swiping through a highly encrypted folder of financial documents I had prepared months in advance for this exact scenario. My thumb hovered directly over a specific PDF file. I slowly raised my head and met Patricia's furious, bloodshot gaze. The chaotic noise of the fleeing relatives and the idling police engines seemed to fade entirely into the background. I smiled, a cold, empty expression, completely devoid of any trace of daughterly affection. "A Manhattan brownstone?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. "How incredibly interesting that you brought that specific property up now, Mother." Patricia stared at the illuminated screen of my smartphone, her perfectly contoured face twisting from self-righteous fury into genuine confusion. She had expected me to cower to desperately apologize for embarrassing her in front of her high society peers. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us. The heavy, humid night air felt electric, charged with the sudden shift in power. The chaotic background noise of cousins dragging luxury luggage through the thick mud and the steady hum of the police cruiser engines faded into absolute silence. I held the phone steadily unaffected by the venomous hatred burning in my mother's eyes. "You cannot sell the Manhattan brownstone, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal precision across the damp driveway. "Because Dad quietly sold it to a private equity firm 3 years ago to dodge corporate bankruptcy, and you have been renting it ever since." The words hung in the air like a physical strike. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward as if I had violently shoved her. She whipped her head around to glare at her husband, expecting Richard to immediately boom his usual defensive lies and put me back in my proper place. She waited for him to call me delusional, to threaten me with legal ruin, to reaffirm their immense wealth. Richard did absolutely none of those things. The heavy brass keyring he was clutching slipped right through his sweaty fingers. It hit the wet concrete pavement with a sharp metallic clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. His knees visibly shook beneath his ruined, mud-stained tailored suit. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The mighty patriarch, the man who had ruthlessly mocked my career and demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, was completely collapsing under the weight of his own massive financial deception. He had hidden this desperate failure from his wife to maintain his fragile ego, and now his ultimate secret was exposed. "Care to guess who owns that private equity firm?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly over the gentle evening breeze. Patricia opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her eyes darted wildly between my calm face and Richard's trembling frame. The terrifying truth was rapidly sinking into her mind. The golden illusion she had worshipped her entire life was entirely fabricated. She looked at Brittany, whose catastrophic financial mistakes had started this downward spiral, and then she looked back at me. "It is me," I revealed, delivering the fatal blow with unflinching eye contact. "I own Vanguard Equity. I purchased your debt when no traditional bank would touch your rapidly failing portfolio. I own the brownstone. I am your landlord." "That is a complete lie!" Patricia finally shrieked, her voice cracking with desperate, frantic denial. "You could never afford a property in that exclusive zip code. You are completely making this up because you are bitterly jealous of your sister. Richard, tell her she is lying. Tell her right now." Richard remained perfectly silent, his eyes glued to the muddy driveway. He could not look his wife in the eye. He could not look his favorite golden child in the eye. He knew exactly what he had signed. I did not waste my breath arguing with a woman who had spent 33 years denying my reality. Instead, I tilted my phone screen toward her, displaying the crisp, legally binding digital lease agreement bearing her husband's frantic digital signature. I scrolled slowly down the bright screen, bypassing the massive monthly rental amounts and strict financial penalties he had agreed to in his desperation. I stopped specifically on page 14, highlighting a heavily bolded section of the contract. When Dad came to my firm begging for a discreet buyout to save his fragile pride, I made sure my corporate lawyers drafted a very specific ironclad tenant agreement. I explained, maintaining a tone of absolute chilling calm. I knew exactly how volatile this family could be. I knew how quickly you resorted to verbal abuse and intimidation when things did not go your way. So I included a mandatory morality clause. Patricia stared at the bold text, her eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently as she read the stipulations. The reality of her total vulnerability was finally breaking through her impenetrable arrogance. She reached out a shaking hand, her fingers grasping uselessly at the humid air as if she could somehow stop what was happening. "Per the strict morality clause in your lease," I recited from memory, my voice dropping an octave to ensure maximum impact. "Any police involvement, harassment, or violence toward the landlord results in immediate termination of the contract." I slowly shifted my gaze from my terrified mother to the imposing figure of Officer Mitchell standing a few feet away. The veteran policeman was watching the exchange with professional detachment, his hand resting securely on his radio. He had already witnessed the harassment. He had already documented the criminal trespassing. He had already intervened in the attempted physical assault by Kendrick. Every single condition of the morality clause had been blatantly publicly violated on my front lawn by the people who claimed to be my superiors. Patricia realized it at the exact same moment. She looked at the police cruisers, then at the mud covering her shoes, and finally at the glowing screen of my smartphone. The color completely drained from her face. She opened her mouth to beg to plead for mercy from the daughter she had always treated like absolute garbage. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting smile. I simply pressed my thumb against the bottom of the digital screen. I hit send. The police report from this altercation was just filed, I announced, sliding the smartphone back into the pocket of my jacket. Your eviction notice was emailed. You are officially homeless as of 5 p.m. today. Patricia stared at her phone, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the digital eviction notice materialized in her inbox. The unmistakable ping of an incoming email echoed loudly in the damp night air, followed by a synchronized chime from Richard's pocket. The devastating reality of their new status washed over them. They were entirely stripped of their lavish Manhattan sanctuary, publicly humiliated and officially homeless. The elite socialites and wealthy investors who had accompanied them on this disastrous trip began whispering furiously among themselves, casting nervous, judgmental glances at the fallen patriarch and his crumbling dynasty. The pristine reputation my parents had spent 40 years ruthlessly building was evaporating in front of a live, captive audience. Kendrick could sense the rapidly shifting tide. The powerful tech CEO who had built his entire identity on projecting absolute dominance and unshakable financial superiority realized that standing next to his disgraced in-laws was actively damaging his own pristine brand. He needed to immediately seize control of the narrative before his VIP investors lost faith in his judgment. Kendrick squared his broad shoulders, adjusted the lapels of his mud-splattered designer jacket, and stepped deliberately in front of Patricia. He puffed out his chest completely, ignoring the flashing police lights illuminating his arrogant face. "So what?" Kendrick scoffed, his voice dripping with absolute contempt as he tried to save face in front of his audience. "You think evicting them makes you some kind of mastermind? You think you have won because you own a single piece of Manhattan real estate? It does not matter. They can come live in my $10 million mansion in the Hamptons. We have 3 guest wings that are bigger than this entire property." Kendrick turned slightly, ensuring his VIP investors could hear every single word of his triumphant boast. He gestured dismissively in my direction, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his features. "My company Apex Solutions officially IPOs next week," Kendrick loudly proclaimed. "We are launching with a starting valuation of $2 billion. I will buy Richard and Patricia a new brownstone just to serve as a storage closet for our excess luggage. We wipe our shoes with money like yours. You are nothing but an insignificant blip on our radar." The sheer blinding arrogance of his statement hung heavily in the humid air. Patricia let out a shaky breath of relief, instantly clinging to her wealthy son-in-law as her ultimate savior. Brittany perked up a smug, triumphant smile, returning to her perfectly contoured face. They truly believed Kendrick had just rescued them from total ruin. They believed his immense corporate power would shield them from the consequences of their actions. I looked directly into Kendrick's smug, arrogant eyes. I did not scream. I did not defend my wealth or justify my position. Instead, I laughed. The sound was dark, chilling, and completely devoid of any humor. The cold, calculated sound cut straight through the tension, instantly silencing the murmuring investors. My laughter unnerved Kendrick. His confident sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. He shifted his weight uncomfortably against the wet pavement, entirely unsure of how to process my total lack of intimidation. Apex Solutions. I repeated, letting the name of his beloved company roll off my tongue with lethal precision. "That is a very impressive valuation, Kendrick. But tell me, are we talking about the same Apex Solutions currently covering up a massive illegal data breach of 4 million active users?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of profound, suffocating quiet that occurs right before a massive explosion. The whispering among the elite investors instantly ceased. Several of them physically stiffened their heads, snapping toward Kendrick with expressions of sudden intense alarm. In the corporate world, a data breach before an initial public offering was the ultimate kiss of death. It was a scandal that destroyed entire empires overnight. Kendrick physically recoiled, as if he had been struck by lightning. The arrogant, untouchable tech billionaire instantly vanished. His jaw dropped open, and the color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth to formulate a denial to scream that I was lying, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, refusing to let him break eye contact. The air between us felt charged with lethal electricity. Yes, I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the driveway to ensure every single investor heard the devastating truth. The same Apex Solutions that deliberately failed to notify their consumer base about the compromised security protocols. The same Apex that secretly hired a ghost crisis public relations firm for $2 million in untraceable corporate funds. You authorized that massive payment to systematically bury the scandal and hide the illegal breach from the Securities and Exchange Commission before your precious IPO launches next week. The reaction from the VIP investors was instantaneous and catastrophic. Two men in expensive suits immediately pulled out their cell phones, stepping frantically away from Kendrick as if he were highly contagious. They began dialing their corporate attorneys, their faces pale with panic. Kendrick had just implicated them in a massive federal crime. The SEC did not take kindly to hidden data breaches, and any investor tied to the fraudulent IPO was about to face devastating federal scrutiny. The golden ticket they thought they had secured was actually a one-way ticket to federal prison. Kendrick staggered backward. His knees visibly shook beneath his tailored trousers. The impenetrable armor of his massive wealth and corporate dominance dissolved completely, leaving behind a terrified, broken man who realized his entire life was about to implode. He looked at the investors scrambling to distance themselves from him. He looked at the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Finally, he looked back at me, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "How?" Kendrick stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, breathless whisper. "How do you know about the shadow firm?" Kendrick's pathetic, stammering question hung heavily in the thick, humid air, completely and utterly destroying whatever residual authority he thought he possessed. His panicked eyes darted frantically around the dark driveway, desperately searching for a lifeline that simply did not exist. He looked at the flashing red and blue police lights, then at the horrified faces of the billionaire investors he had brought along to witness my supposed humiliation, and finally back to me. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. I let the absolute silence stretch, forcing him to drown in his own mounting terror before I finally answered. "Because I am the CEO of that shadow firm," I stated, my voice ringing out with lethal clarity. "You called my company a pathetic little gig just 10 minutes ago. You mocked the very public relations agency you secretly wired $2 million to last month in a desperate, frantic bid to save your sinking ship. You thought you were hiring an anonymous corporate fixer from a shell corporation. You never bothered to read the actual names on the incorporation documents you signed." Kendrick stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding in the thick mud. He shook his head violently from side to side, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was trying to process the magnitude of the trap he had blindly walked into. "My firm holds the highly classified non-disclosure agreement, keeping you out of federal prison." I continued, stepping closer to him, entirely unfazed by his physical panic. "We hold the encrypted servers containing every single internal memo, every panicked email, and every directive you personally issued instructing your engineering team to illegally cover up the massive data breach of 4 million active users." "You were safe," I added, maintaining a tone of chilling professional detachment. "As long as you adhered to the strict legal parameters of our corporate contract, your dirty little secret remained perfectly secure behind our encrypted firewalls. But my agency has an incredibly strict, non-negotiable client ethics clause built into every single contract we execute. Kendrick grabbed his own hair, his perfectly styled gelled locks falling in chaotic strands across his forehead. He knew exactly what was coming. And since you just physically assaulted my husband right here on my front lawn directly in front of armed law enforcement officers, I declared, gesturing calmly toward Officer Mitchell, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression of grim satisfaction. You explicitly and undeniably violated that standard client ethics clause. You breached the contract, Kendrick. The confidentiality agreement is completely null and void as of 5 minutes ago. The collective reaction from the driveway was instantaneous and brutal. The VIP investors, the same men who had swaggered onto my property, treating me like an insignificant peasant, erupted into a frenzy of panicked action. A tall man in a tailored silver suit practically sprinted toward his idling limousine, ripping his smartphone from his pocket. He began shouting frantic orders to his financial team, demanding they immediately pull all capital investments from Apex Solutions. Beside him, a venture capitalist furiously tapped away on a tablet, desperately canceling pending wire transfers that were meant to fund Kendrick's fraudulent initial public offering. They were jumping off the sinking ship with terrifying speed. In the corporate world, an SEC investigation into a hidden data breach was toxic. Associating with a CEO facing federal fraud charges meant financial suicide. Within a matter of seconds, the $2 billion valuation Kendrick had bragged about evaporated into nothing but worthless imaginary numbers. He was watching his entire empire burn to the ground in real time. Brittany finally realized the absolute gravity of the situation. Her perfect manicured hands flew to her face, a piercing shriek escaping her throat as she watched the billionaire investors physically abandon them. She lunged forward, grabbing Kendrick's mud-splattered jacket, shaking him violently. She demanded he fix it, demanded he stop the investors from leaving completely incapable of processing that the endless flow of corporate wealth had just been permanently severed. She was not just losing her inheritance today. She was losing the golden goose she had married. Kendrick violently shoved her away, utterly indifferent to his wife's sudden panic. He dropped to his knees right there in the deep, muddy sludge of my driveway. The mud soaked through his expensive trousers, staining the fabric, but he did not care. The arrogant sneer that had defined his entire existence had vanished entirely, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot, tears of pure desperation spilling down his cheeks. "Please!" Kendrick begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, Natalie, I will give you anything. I will give you half the company. I will transfer $50 million to your account right now. Just reinstate the non-disclosure agreement. If the SEC finds out about the breach, they will not just cancel the public offering. They will send me to a federal prison. Please, Natalie, I am begging you. You absolutely cannot do this to me." I looked down at the pathetic, sobbing man currently kneeling in the cold dirt. I felt absolutely no sympathy for him, nor for the screaming woman beside him, nor for the horrified parents watching their entire legacy crumble into dust. They had spent their entire lives trampling over anyone they deemed beneath them, perfectly comfortable, destroying lives to elevate their own status. They had tragically mistaken my long silence for permanent weakness, and my quiet patience for absolute total submission. I slowly raised my smartphone one final time, the bright glowing screen illuminating the absolute total devastation now permanently etched across his pale, sweating face. David just automated the unredacted data breach report directly to the SEC. I stated smoothly, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Say goodbye to your IPO, Kendrick. You will be lucky if you only get 10 years. The last of the VIP investors did not even bother to offer a parting word. Tires screeched violently against the wet asphalt as the fleet of black luxury town cars and limousines accelerated down the long driveway, desperate to put as much physical and legal distance between themselves and Kendrick as humanly possible. Their taillights bled into the dark, humid night, carrying away the absolute last shred of his $2 billion empire. Kendrick stared at the empty space. The horrific reality of federal prison and the immediate vaporization of his ungodly wealth slammed into him simultaneously. His breathing turned ragged. He clutched his chest, his impeccably manicured fingers digging fiercely into the lapels of his mud-stained designer jacket. He gasped for air that his lungs suddenly refused to process. His knees buckled completely. The mighty tech titan, the man who had just proudly bragged about wiping his shoes with my money, collapsed heavily onto the manicured lawn. He curled into a pathetic, trembling ball in the cold dirt, openly weeping as a full-blown panic attack seized his entire body. Officer Mitchell did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. The veteran policeman stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. He reached to the back of his utility belt and unclipped a pair of solid steel handcuffs, the metallic rattling sound cutting sharply through Kendrick's hysterical sobbing. Kendrick lowered his hands from his face, his bloodshot eyes widening in fresh terror as he saw the cuffs. He tried to scramble backward, pushing his feet weakly against the wet grass, but his limbs completely failed him. "You are under arrest for assault and battery." Officer Mitchell stated his commanding voice, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. "You deliberately and maliciously struck a man on this property earlier this evening. Stand up and place your hands behind your back immediately." Kendrick could not stand. Officer Mitchell firmly grabbed him by the shoulder, hauling the blubbering billionaire to his feet before swiftly wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp mechanical click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed across the driveway, securing his absolute downfall. Brittany stood a few feet away, her mouth hanging wide open in pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at her husband, the man she had married strictly for his massive wealth and societal power, now restrained like a common criminal in the mud. Instead of rushing to comfort him, her shock rapidly morphed into vicious, self-serving rage. She lunged forward, her face contorted with absolute fury. "You stupid, arrogant fool!" Brittany screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You ruined everything. You lied to me about the company. You lied about the money. You are going to prison and leaving me with absolutely nothing. You are worthless." Kendrick did not even have the breath left to mount a defense against his furious wife. His chest heaved as he simply stared blankly. He weakly tried to respond, but Officer Mitchell was already marching him toward the back of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, trapping the disgraced CEO inside the cramped, unglamorous cage, completely cutting off his desperate apologies. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the utter destruction of my entire biological family. A second pair of police officers had already flanked Richard and Patricia, enforcing the trespassing ultimatum with uncompromising efficiency. The mighty patriarch and his flawless society queen were being physically escorted off the premises. They had spent 40 years ruthlessly building a pristine, untouchable empire based entirely on lies, manipulation, and the cruel exploitation of their own daughter. Now they were being marched down my driveway, like vagrants completely stripped of their fake wealth and their stolen dignity. Patricia was crying hysterically, her heavy makeup running in dark, messy streaks down her pale, heavily powdered cheeks. She clutched her ruined designer handbag against her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold reality of her new homeless status finally crushed her arrogant spirit. Richard stumbled beside her, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. He stared blankly at the wet pavement, a completely broken man who had just lost his house, his fortune, and his carefully curated legacy in a single devastating evening. The cousins and uncles who had always bowed to his financial supremacy were already gone, having fled the scene the second they realized the money had dried up. I stood motionless on the damp concrete, watching them walk away. For 33 years I had craved their validation. I had quietly accepted their cruelty, desperately hoping that if I just shrunk myself enough, if I just accommodated their endless demands, they might finally love me. I had funded their extravagant lifestyle in secret, sacrificing my own peace of mind to maintain their fragile, toxic illusion. But as I watched them disappear into the shadows at the end of the long, muddy driveway, I felt absolutely nothing. No regret, no guilt, no lingering desire to save them from the consequences of their own horrific actions. The vulnerable, desperate woman who had begged for their approval had completely died the moment they chose their own pride over my suffocating infant. The chaotic noise of the police cruisers and Brittany's continued screaming faded away as I walked purposefully toward the rear bumper of the waiting ambulance. David was sitting inside, holding Lily securely in his arms. My husband looked up at me, his bruised face breaking into a soft, relieved smile. The paramedics had already stabilized Lily, her breathing finally clear and steady, the terrifying crisis expertly managed. The paramedic closed the heavy ambulance doors, shutting out the flashing strobe lights and the bitter wailing of my former family. Simultaneously, the automated security system I had installed triggered its final command. I turned my back on all of them, stepped into the ambulance with David and Lily, and the heavy metal shutters of the beach house slammed shut once more, locking the toxicity out forever. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Within 72 hours of the catastrophic driveway confrontation, Apex Solutions officially filed for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy. The highly anticipated $2 billion initial public offering completely vanished, replaced by a massive aggressive investigation launched directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Kendrick did not just lose his prestigious company, he lost his freedom. Federal agents formally indicted the disgraced tech titan on multiple counts of corporate fraud and deliberate obstruction of justice. The national news networks gleefully broadcasted aerial footage of Kendrick being escorted into a federal courthouse wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily shackled in front of him. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire who had ruthlessly mocked my family was now facing 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His pristine, dominant reputation was entirely shredded, permanently replaced by a legacy of pathetic, desperate criminal failure. The destruction of my biological parents was equally absolute and utterly humiliating. The lavish Manhattan brownstone, the ultimate symbol of their high society dominance, was swiftly seized by the bank. The luxurious property went to a private auction less than 3 weeks later, purchased by an investor who completely erased 40 years of Patricia and Richard's carefully curated upper-class history. Exposed to their elite social circle as entirely broke, fraudulent liabilities, my parents were viciously and permanently excommunicated from the wealthy Manhattan elite. The country club memberships were instantly revoked. The gala invitations completely stopped arriving. The wealthy friends who had once clamored to attend their extravagant dinner parties now actively crossed the street to avoid acknowledging their existence. With absolutely zero financial resources left to salvage their shattered image, Patricia and Richard were forced to pack their few remaining possessions into cheap cardboard boxes. They relocated to a tiny, damp 2-bedroom apartment in a severely run-down suburb. The peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights of their new reality stood in stark, punishing contrast to the opulent lifestyle they had brutally demanded I finance. Richard, the former master of the universe, who had commanded entire boardrooms, now spent his miserable days arguing with a disinterested landlord over a broken water heater. Patricia, who had built her entire identity on projecting flawless superiority and tearing down my self-esteem, refused to leave the cramped apartment. She spent her days staring blankly at the peeling linoleum floor, completely paralyzed by the crushing, inescapable weight of her total social annihilation. Brittany experienced the steepest, most agonizing fall of all. The golden child who had spent her entire existence being praised, coddled, and elevated at my expense, was violently stripped of every single privilege she had ever known. Kendrick's heavily frozen assets left her completely destitute, drowning under a massive mountain of mounting legal fees and aggressive creditor lawsuits. With absolutely no usable skills and a toxic reputation that made her entirely unemployable in the corporate sector, Brittany was forced into the exact kind of manual labor she had spent her entire life ruthlessly mocking. The former society princess secured a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing store inside a dying shopping mall. Her daily reality now consisted of standing on her feet for agonizing 9-hour shifts, folding cheap synthetic sweaters, and enduring the loud complaints of frustrated bargain hunters. Her perfect expensive manicures were quickly replaced by chipped nails and calloused hands. The designer wardrobe she had flaunted so proudly was traded for a stiff, unflattering polyester uniform featuring a plastic name tag. She spent her short, unpaid lunch breaks crying quietly in the employee break room, calling former wealthy friends who automatically sent her straight to voicemail. The ultimate golden child was finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world entirely devoid of the protective financial bubble I had unknowingly provided for her. Meanwhile, my world transformed into a vibrant, peaceful sanctuary. The heavy metal shutters of the beach house remained securely locked against the toxic noise of the past, but the interior was filled with profound warmth and genuine love. Lily's medical crisis was expertly resolved, her bright, joyful laughter once again echoing through the sunlit corridors of our home. David and I focused entirely on nurturing our family, building a beautiful life grounded in mutual respect, unbreakable trust, and absolute authenticity. My public relations firm reached unprecedented levels of success, attracting high-profile clients who valued our fierce integrity and unwavering commitment to ethical transparency. We thrived completely unburdened by the crushing parasitic demands of my former family. The final pathetic attempt at contact occurred exactly 6 months after the driveway incident. I was sitting at my home office desk, sipping hot coffee and watching the morning waves crash gently against the pristine shoreline. The soft chime of an incoming email momentarily broke the tranquil silence. I glanced at the glowing screen. The sender name displayed Patricia Wilson. The subject line was a frantic plea. It read, "Please, Natalie, we have absolutely nothing left. I am begging you for forgiveness." I stared at the bold black text for a long, quiet moment. I imagined Patricia sitting in her cramped, miserable apartment, typing those desperate words, finally realizing that the daughter she had mercilessly tortured was her only remaining lifeline. I visualized the absolute panic driving her fingers across the cheap plastic keyboard. I felt the familiar pull of ingrained obedience trying to assert itself, demanding that I fix her problems, demanding that I sacrifice my peace to rescue her from the consequences of her own devastating cruelty. Instead of opening the message, I calmly moved my cursor over the small trash can icon. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the slightest urge to read her frantic apologies or absorb her toxic manipulation. I simply pressed the button. The email vanished instantly, permanently deleted without a single word being read. I closed my laptop, smiled at the beautiful ocean view, and walked upstairs to embrace my wonderful husband and daughter. Closing that laptop lid felt like severing the final fraying thread tethering me to a lifetime of abuse. The definitive click of the machine shutting down echoed in the quiet room, sounding remarkably like a lock clicking into place. I walked up the hardwood stairs, my bare feet making no sound, and with every step, the phantom weight I had carried on my shoulders for 33 years simply dissolved. I did not look back. I did not wonder about the contents of that deleted email. I simply let them go. 6 months passed, replacing the bitter, freezing chaos of that horrific winter night with the golden restorative warmth of a late July afternoon. The transition of time worked like a cleansing tide, washing away the residual grime of my former biological family and leaving behind a pristine, untouched canvas. The heavy automated metal security shutters of our Hamptons beach house were currently rolled up and hidden away, completely unnecessary on a day this spectacular. Sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a living space that felt entirely different now. It was no longer a secret fortress built to hide my success from my greedy parents, nor a silent refuge to escape my sister's relentless demands. It was simply a home. Our home. I stepped out onto the expansive wooden deck, the salty ocean breeze immediately catching my hair. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out endlessly before me, a brilliant, sparkling expanse of sapphire blue. A few yards away, right on the edge of our private stretch of pristine white sand, The two most important people in my entire universe were busy constructing a massive, highly ambitious sandcastle. Lily let out a loud, joyous shriek of pure delight. The sound carried over the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves, bright and entirely free of pain. Seeing her now, her chubby cheeks flushed with healthy color, and her small hands eagerly scooping up wet sand, it was almost impossible to reconcile this vibrant, energetic toddler with the terrifyingly still blue-lipped infant from 6 months ago. The pediatric cardiologist had declared her complete recovery, nothing short of miraculous, but I knew the truth. She had healed because she was finally growing up in an environment completely devoid of toxic stress. David sat cross-legged in the sand beside her, his rolled-up trousers damp with seawater, meticulously carving a moat around their sandy fortress with a bright yellow plastic shovel. He looked up, sensing my presence on the deck, and flashed a warm, knowing smile. The deep purple bruises Kendrick had inflicted on his face had faded months ago, leaving no physical scars, but the fierce, unyielding devotion my husband had demonstrated that night was permanently etched into the absolute core of our marriage. He had stood between our daughter and a monster, and he had never once asked me to compromise my boundaries to keep the peace. I walked down the wooden stairs, my feet sinking into the warm, sun-baked sand, and dropped my beach towel a few yards away from their construction zone. I placed my smartphone on the corner of the towel. The screen remained completely dark. There were absolutely no frantic, demanding text messages lighting up the display. There were no manipulative voicemails from my mother attempting to guilt-trip me into funding another fake lifestyle. There were no uninvited guests showing up at my security gate demanding entrance, and there were zero expectations to fulfill other than my own. The absolute profound silence from my past was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My public relations firm had completely skyrocketed following the spectacular, highly publicized implosion of Apex Solutions. The industry had quickly realized that the shadow firm responsible for exposing Kendrick's massive federal fraud was run by someone with an unbreakable ethical backbone. Clients now sought us out specifically for our uncompromising integrity. Just an hour ago, I had finalized a massive multi-year contract with a revolutionary clean energy initiative, securing a retainer that easily dwarfed the gross revenue of my father's entire former manufacturing business. I had won completely on my own terms, using my own unshakable ethics, without ever having to shrink myself to fit into their narrow, conditional version of success. I had built an empire that no one could ever claim credit for, and I had done it while fiercely protecting the people I actually loved. I settled onto the soft towel, wrapping my arms casually around my knees, and allowed the gentle afternoon sun to warm my skin. The profound, deep-seated peace I felt right now was not merely the absence of conflict, it was the active, conscious presence of safety. I had spent over 3 decades believing that family was a mandatory biological sentence, a heavy, suffocating debt that I had to constantly repay through endless submission, financial sacrifice, and emotional self-destruction. I had believed that drawing a line in the sand meant I was a bad daughter, a cruel sister, a fundamentally broken person. But watching David suddenly scoop Lily up into his strong arms, spinning her around as she threw her head back and laughed against the bright blue summer sky, the absolute truth finally crystallized in my mind with perfect, unshatterable clarity. My greatest success was not the thriving corporate empire I had built, nor the massive wealth I had quietly accumulated. My ultimate masterpiece was the impenetrable, unyielding boundary I had finally found the courage to build around my own heart. David caught my eye, his face radiating pure, unconditional love, and he began walking toward me with our beautiful, laughing daughter safely cradled against his chest. I smiled back at him, feeling an overwhelming, profoundly deep sense of gratitude for the beautiful life we had fought so incredibly hard to protect. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by the people who respect your locked doors and only enter when you gladly hand them the key.
you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every